Aldous Huxley is most famous for his dystopian novel Brave New World, a classic of the 20th century that is still widely read and discussed today. But there was much more to his writing than simply science fiction. A self-avowed agnostic and skeptic of religion, Huxley nevertheless devoted a great deal of time and effort to studying the world's religions. He was an early Western proponent for the use of psychedelic drugs to induce mystical experiences, and wrote the introduction to an English translation of the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Prabhavananda. But his most famous contribution to the field of religion and spirituality was his 1945 book, The Perennial Philosophy. This book is widely credited as having first popularized the 15th century Renaissance concept of an underlying current of truth expressing itself in different forms and across time within the major religions of the world. The MVP of religion. So long as the perennial philosophy is accepted in its essential simplicity, there is no need of willed assent to propositions known in advance to be unverifiable. In Chapter 24, Ritual, Symbol, Sacrament, Huxley describes individual religions with all of their symbols, stories, concepts, and characters as like languages, and points out that you can describe a rock in English, Chinese, or Arabic just as well. That is not to say, however, that he accepted any religion in its entirety. The book is filled in equal parts with odes and critiques of the various religions that it covers. Huxley believed in a golden thread of truth connecting them, but he also believed that many religious organizations and traditions had in some way strayed from this original source. In Chapter 8 of the book Religion and Temperament, he also points out that various spiritual paths may be better or worse suited to people of different temperaments and inclinations. His goal, it seems, was to strip back the cultural and political accumulations to unveil a minimal viable product of religion. A simple exposition of the perennial philosophy itself without any of the unnecessary baggage. In doing so, he sought to root his work not in revelation or received tradition, but in philosophy and rational thought, accessible equally to the believer or the skeptic. Esotericism and mysticism. Perennial philosophers are primarily concerned with liberation and enlightenment. Huxley's exposition of the perennial philosophy is a personal path of spiritual development focused on the direct experience of the divine. He does not devote a great deal of time to metaphysics or cosmology. Likewise, the moral, communal, and symbolic aspects of religion are seen as tools to create an environment that facilitates spiritual growth and experience in the maximum number of individuals, rather than ends in their own right. As such, he concentrates mostly on the esoteric, monastic, and mystical strains of the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He also cites Eastern sources from Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism a great deal. So what is the perennial philosophy, according to Aldous Huxley? Huxley identifies a few basic tenets from which the perennial philosophy is composed. There is a transcendent design, an eternal ultimate reality. There is an immanent divine, a ground of being and spiritual nature within the world. The transcendent divine and immanent divine are in truth one thing, and the goal of spirituality is to realize and experience this as a divine union with the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is empty of all particular forms or characteristics. Huxley writes a lot about idolatry as the source of error in religion, as people wrongly attribute particular characteristics to an ineffable God. Ultimate reality must be perceived for yourself. It cannot, having no particular characteristics, be expressed in words. This is achieved through self-naughting, which is the mortification or sacrifice of the self and its selfish preoccupations. Spiritual attainment requires severing your attachments to the material. If you think this sounds more similar to Eastern traditions than Western, you may be right, at least in part. but Huxley quotes liberally from Christian theologians, Sufi mystics, and European philosophers in making each of his points. He also shows a tendency to explain concepts in Western, rather than Eastern terminology. Charity, which he describes in Christian terms as selfless love rather than mere almsgiving or simple emotion, has a central place in the philosophy he presents. Non-attachment is explained more through the Christian concept of mortification than through Buddhist scriptures. Enlightenment is presented in terms of spiritual grace and salvation. Meditation, while mentioned in passing, takes second place to his explanation of the various forms of prayer: petitionary, intercessional, and contemplative. Other interesting ideas include his concept of the eternal present, which he formulates in distinction to the specious present, and his regular denouncements of traditions that seek to escape the world, either through physical isolation and asceticism or to some inner nirvana. Huxley gives substantial preference to remaining deeply rooted within the world, explicitly mentioning the way of the Bodhisattva as an example of this. The tendency to depart from this is one of a number of criticisms of Eastern traditions which he presents, giving the book a more balanced tone than you may think. The style of the book. Huxley was a storyteller and not an academic, and this shows through in the style of the book itself. It is not an academic book, but does a fantastic job of weaving together seemingly disparate sources into a coherent narrative. The general style of his writing is to start by making a point in his own words, without much reference to how he came to this conclusion, and then cite multiple quotes from various different religions and times to support his case. These quotes are an absolute joy to read. I would recommend the book to anyone with an interest in spirituality purely for the quotes, even if you don't particularly agree with his main premise on the perennial philosophy. I would estimate at least a third of the book's word count is composed of these quotes, which primarily come from Christianity, Sufi Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, although there are other sources as well. If you are interested in learning more about Huxley's explanation of the perennial philosophy, links to purchase the book from Amazon in the USA and in the UK are in the video description.